1944. The world was on fire. Allied generals were desperate, their plans hanging by a thread. The beaches of northern France, soon to be called D-Day, waited like a sleeping monster, bristling with steel, mines, and death. Every inch of sand was trapped. Every approach was wired to kill. Engineers, soldiers, and scientists stared at the impossible maps of Omaha and Sword Beach and saw only one thing: failure. But far from the strategy rooms of London, in the quiet fields of Lincolnshire, a simple farmer was working on something that made no sense to anyone. A strange, rattling machine that looked like it belonged in a junkyard, not on a battlefield. His neighbors called it madness. His army contacts called it a waste of time. But on June 6, 1944, that crazy machine would save thousands of lives and change the course of the war forever. His name was Percy Hobart, a man born not into genius or glory, but into the mud and grit of English farmland. Before the war, he wasn't an inventor, a soldier, or a scientist. He was a builder of machines, a tinkerer, the kind of man who looked at broken plows and thought, this could be better. But when war came to Europe and Nazi power spread across the continent like a shadow, Percy traded his fields for the army and his curiosity for duty. Yet duty didn't sit quietly with him. He was restless, unorthodox, and endlessly stubborn. To his superiors, that was a problem. To history, it was a miracle waiting to happen. In 1940, when France fell and the world seemed to collapse with it, Hobart found himself dismissed from the British Army, accused of being too eccentric, too unconventional. They said he was a dreamer, not a commander. But he wasn't done dreaming. As he sat back on his farm, surrounded by the low hum of tractors and the ache of humiliation, he started seeing the future. Not in the clouds of war, but in the soil beneath his boots. He began to sketch strange designs in the margins of old newspapers. Tanks with flails, rollers, bridges, and cages. Machines that could crush mines, clear obstacles, and defy the nightmare of fortified beaches. Everyone who saw them laughed. "It's nonsense, Hobart," they said. "You can't make a tank plow through sand and mines like a tractor." But he remembered something the army had forgotten. That war, like farming, was about adaptation. You don't fight the land, you work with it. By 1942, British command was planning for an invasion of France, and they had a problem no general could solve. The Germans had turned the coast into a fortress. Steel spikes, barbed wire, concrete bunkers, hidden mines. No vehicle could get through, no soldier could survive long enough to clear the way. That's when someone remembered Hobart, the mad tankman who'd once refused to give up on impossible machines. When the call came, he was already in his 60s. He could have refused. He could have said he was too old, too tired, too forgotten. Instead, he cleaned the dirt from his hands and said simply, "Let's get to work." They gave him a small team, a forgotten hangar, and a handful of broken tanks. From there, the impossible began to take shape. Days turned into nights. Sparks flew in the cold English air as Hobart and his men welded together armor, rollers, chains, and plows. He called them funnies, not because they were humorous, but because they were unbelievable. There was the crab, a tank that thrashed the ground with spinning chains to detonate mines, the crocodile that spewed fire to clear bunkers, the bobbin that laid down roadways across soft sand so other tanks could pass. To the untrained eye, they looked ridiculous. Lumbering beasts made of scrap and stubbornness. But Hobart didn't care how they looked. He cared if they worked. And when they did, the impossible suddenly looked possible. In the damp fields of England, under rain and secrecy, the weapons that would decide D-Day were being born, not in the halls of command, but in the hands of a man everyone had called crazy. And yet, even as his machines roared to life, Hobart knew that their true test lay ahead, across the channel, on the deadliest beaches the world had ever seen. The world would soon learn that genius sometimes wears the face of madness, and that salvation can rise from the mud of a forgotten farm. By the winter of 1943, Hobart's wild collection of modified tanks, his so-called funnies, had become more than a personal obsession. They were now the desperate gamble of an entire invasion plan. The Allies had failed before at Dieppe, a brutal rehearsal where hundreds died on the beaches, trapped by mines and wire. Every general remembered that horror. Every soldier feared it would happen again on D-Day. But Hobart refused to let history repeat itself. Inside the freezing workshops of Britain, his team of engineers, welders, and farmers worked like possessed men. They stripped old Churchill and Sherman tanks to their bones, grafting them with metal arms and flailing chains, covering them in steel nets, flame projectors, and bridge-launching frames. Sparks flew, smoke thickened, and the night sky glowed orange as his impossible vision began to roar to life. The first crab tank rolled forward like some prehistoric creature, its whirling chains smashing the ground ahead, detonating mines with a thunderous rhythm that echoed across the test fields. Soldiers laughed at first, then stared in disbelief as explosions ripped the earth apart, and yet the tank rolled on unharmed. What looked insane suddenly made sense. Hobart's machines were not just inventions. They were hope, forged in steel. Word began to spread through the ranks. The old madman's tanks actually work. Still, the doubters were relentless. Commanders scoffed that the devices were too slow, too ugly, too unpredictable for combat. Hobart stood silent, watching as one of his flame-throwing crocodiles fired a jet of fire 100 yards long, melting through armor and terror alike. He turned to them and said quietly, "Let the results speak." And they did. By spring, Eisenhower himself demanded a demonstration. Generals, officers, and strategists gathered as Hobart's funnies performed a spectacle of engineering defiance. Minefields cleared, ditches bridged, obstacles flattened in minutes. The silence that followed was heavier than applause. Even the skeptics knew these machines could turn the slaughter of Normandy into a fighting chance. In June 1944, as thousands of Allied landing craft crossed the English Channel, Hobart's creations went with them, not as curiosities but as lifelines. On sword and gold beaches, the funnies led the assault. The crabs beat paths through minefields, their chain flails striking the sand like drums of thunder. The crocodiles unleashed waves of flame against pillboxes that had slaughtered men at Dieppe. The bobbin tanks rolled out canvas roads over shifting dunes, letting reinforcements surge forward where before they would have sunk and died. The chaos of battle swallowed the beaches, smoke, screams, salt, and steel. Yet amid the inferno, Hobart's machines kept moving. Soldiers later said it was like watching monsters carve corridors through hell. By nightfall, the beaches were won. D-Day had not been perfect. But without those bizarre contraptions, it might have been a massacre. From that day, the name Hobart's Funnies stopped being a joke. The man once dismissed as a lunatic farmer became the quiet architect of the greatest invasion in history, a reminder that sometimes the future is built not in laboratories or war rooms, but in barns, by hands calloused from work and hearts unwilling to give up. As dawn broke over the beaches of Normandy, the roar of engines and the thunder of artillery mixed with the hiss of sea spray and smoke. Hobart's Funnies were no longer secret prototypes. They were fighting for the soul of Europe. The moment the landing craft ramps slammed down, chaos exploded, bullets slicing through the mist, sand erupting under mortar fire, men diving for cover as German machine guns opened up from the cliffs. And yet, through the storm of metal, came the sound that no one had ever heard before, a deep, rhythmic clatter, like iron chains tearing through the earth. It was the crabs. Their flails swung in wide arcs, smashing the ground ahead, detonating mines in bursts of fire that lit the fog like lightning. Each explosion shook it at the beach, but each one cleared a few more feet of deadly ground. Behind them, infantry followed, terrified, exhausted, but alive. For every path the funnies carved, 100 men found safety. For every mine they destroyed, the invasion moved one heartbeat closer to survival. On Sword Beach, a single flail tank cleared nearly 200 yards under relentless fire before being hit. Even as it burned, another took its place, its crew knowing what awaited them and going anyway. That was the silent courage Hobart had built into his machines. Not just steel, but resolve. Further west, on Juno and Gold, the crocodiles advanced, their flamethrowers roaring like dragons across the concrete bunkers that had once been invincible. German soldiers, stunned by the jets of flame, abandoned their positions. breaking lines that had been considered unbreakable. The tide turned not through sheer numbers, but through imagination. Hobart's vision, born in ridicule and built in solitude, was now rewriting the battlefield in real time. As the smoke thickened and the sand turned red, engineers used the bobbin tanks to roll out fabric roads across sinking dunes, creating solid ground for reinforcements. In hours, the beaches transformed from killing zones into gateways of liberation. Every strange contraption, every welded joint, every absurd-looking part had found its purpose. And yet, far from the battlefront, Hobart himself waited, pacing in silence at headquarters, listening to radio reports that came in broken and blood-soaked. For hours, he didn't know if his funnies had worked or failed, if they had saved lives or died in vain. Then, as the first messages came in, tanks ashore, paths cleared, beaches held, he sat down, closed his eyes, and said nothing. The man who had been called mad had just changed the course of the war. By nightfall, Allied forces had secured their fragile foothold in France. The cost had been terrible, but without Hobart's machines, the cost would have been unimaginable. Generals later admitted it in private. The invasion might have failed without his work. But for Hobart, there was no triumph, no celebration, only a quiet relief, the kind only a man who had once been thrown away and told he was useless could feel. He had built his redemption out of steel and flame, and in doing so had saved the lives of men he would never meet. In the weeks after D-Day, the beaches of Normandy turned into corridors of liberation, and the names of great generals echoed across the headlines. Eisenhower, Montgomery, Patton, but not Hobart. His funnies had done their work, yet history, as it often does, began to forget the hands that built the impossible. While others stood before cameras and medals, Percy Hobart went back to his maps, his sketches, and his endless tinkering. He didn't crave glory, he craved progress. To him, every victory was just proof that imagination could be a weapon. Still, the silence from command was deafening. Many of those who had doubted him before now wanted to erase the memory of their doubt. The higher ranks praised the machines, but not the man who birthed them. Some even claimed his designs had merely been practical adjustments, as if genius could be reduced to a footnote. But in the mess halls and the muddy trenches, soldiers knew the truth. They told stories of how the crabs had beaten death itself, how the crocodiles had turned terror back on the enemy, and how the bobbin tanks had given hope where there had been none. To them, Hobart wasn't a forgotten farmer. He was the ghost of survival that haunted every miracle on those shores. Letters began to reach him from the front, written in smudged ink and blood-stained paper. Your tanks saved us. We wouldn't be here without you. Each letter was worth more to him than any medal. Yet behind his calm eyes, a quiet bitterness remained. He knew the system he served had once abandoned him, had laughed at him, had sent him home in disgrace. And now that same system used his machines to claim victory. But instead of anger, Hobart felt something deeper, a kind of understanding. He realized that innovation had always been born in isolation, that every great leap forward begins with ridicule. He remembered the cold nights on his farm when his only companions were sketches and sparks, and he thought of how close his ideas had come to dying there. If not for a few stubborn allies who had believed in him, men like Montgomery, who saw potential where others saw madness, the funnies would have never existed. And if they hadn't, the sands of Normandy might have run red until the tide erased every trace of freedom. As the Allied advance pushed into France, Belgium, and Germany, Hobart's creations evolved with it. His team designed new bridge-laying tanks for river crossings, new rollers for rubble-filled cities, and new flail systems for clearing mines in liberated towns. Wherever obstacles rose, Hobart's machines followed, opening paths through destruction. Still to the public, he remained invisible, the eccentric engineer buried beneath the weight of victory. When asked later how he endured the years of mockery, Hobart said simply, "Because the problem never cared about opinion." It was a statement as cold and clear as the steel he had shaped. Long after the war, young officers would study his blueprints without realizing the quiet rebellion that had created them. They would learn about the funnies as historical curiosities, unaware that they had been born from the stubborn heart of a man the army tried to forget. Yet the truth remained unshakable. On the morning of June 6, 1944, when the tide of history demanded courage and imagination, it wasn't the polished minds of high command that answered. It was the calloused hands of a farmer who refused to stop building. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945 and Europe exhaled the smoke of its own ruin, the world began to rebuild, brick by brick, soul by soul. But some names faded into the dust faster than others. Percy Hobart was one of them. The war he helped win rolled on without him, swallowed by politics, pride, and the machinery of victory. Yet his fingerprints were everywhere. In the new designs of armored vehicles, in the way engineers now thought about terrain and mobility, in every plan that dared to merge creativity with courage. After the war, Hobart walked through the countryside of England much like he had years before. Only this time the land was quiet, scarred but free. He was older, slower, his hands rough from years of welding and work, but his eyes still held the same spark, the same defiant light that had once seen possibility in the impossible. He knew that wars were not just won by soldiers or strategy, but by minds unafraid to dream under pressure. Every tank that crossed a river, every bridge that spanned a crater, every minefield cleared safely was a silent echo of his vision. And though few outside the military knew his name, those who did whispered it with a kind of reverence, not for the man he was, but for what he represented. To them, Hobart was proof that innovation could bloom even in the mud of skepticism. His machines had carried not just armor and fire, but the weight of belief. The belief that one mind, however ridiculed, could alter the fate of millions. Years later, younger engineers would visit his surviving workshop, now half forgotten, its walls stained with oil and memory. They would run their fingers over the dents in the steel, the burns from welding torches, and imagine the nights when Hobart and his men had worked without sleep, building hope in the dark. It was there that they realized his true invention wasn't mechanical. It was moral. He had redefined what it meant to fight, not by commanding battalions, but by challenging imagination itself. For every soldier who crossed Normandy, for every life saved by a path cleared through fire, there was a piece of Hobart's soul buried in that sand. He never sought monuments or medals, but the beaches became his monument. Each crater a reminder that one person's madness can be another's miracle. In his final years, when asked what he thought of D-Day, Hobart gave an answer as humble as his beginnings. We just found a way to make the land less deadly. That was his genius, simplicity wrapped in defiance. The war had tried to break him, bureaucracy had tried to silence him, and ridicule had tried to bury him. But none of it succeeded, because true vision, like courage, doesn't depend on permission. And that is the legacy Percy Hobart left behind, a lesson whispered through the decades, that even in humanity's darkest hours, salvation often begins with the mind no one believes in. In every age there are crazy dreamers building strange, impossible things, and the world laughs until the day those dreams are needed. Hobart's life reminds us that history doesn't belong to the powerful, but to the persistent, not to those who command, but to those who refuse to stop imagining. And when the world once again stands at the edge of the impossible, it will be the spirit of that crazy farmer, the one who built hope out of steel and willpower, that shows us the way forward. Long after the beaches of Normandy had fallen silent and the echoes of artillery had faded into the sea breeze, the story of Percy Hobart lingered in fragments, in old reports, yellowed blueprints, in the memories of men who owed him their lives. Yet what he left behind was not just metal and machinery, but a message about what it means to create under doubt, to believe when belief itself feels foolish. For Hobart's journey was not a tale of luck or destiny. It was the anatomy of resilience. Every spark that flew from his welder's torch carried defiance. Every dented plate of steel carried faith. When he looked at the impossible, he didn't see defeat. He saw design. He understood that progress has always been built by those the world mocks first and celebrates later. His machines were never just weapons. They were symbols of human adaptability, of minds that refused to surrender to convention. The funnies embodied something far greater than armor or tactics. They represented the triumph of imagination over fear. In a world consumed by destruction, Hobart built, and that act alone was revolutionary. He took the language of farming, plows, rollers, chains, and turned it into the poetry of liberation. He proved that genius does not belong to the chosen few, but to anyone willing to keep thinking when everyone else stops. Generals may have directed battles, but it was the courage of one dismissed dreamer that paved the way for victory. And that is the truth history often hides. Wars are not only fought with rifles and orders, but with stubborn hearts that refuse to accept the word impossible. In every era, there are men and women like Hobart, inventors, builders, thinkers, told they were crazy, wrong, too different, and they work in basements, in barns, in forgotten workshops, unseen and uncelebrated, until one day the world catches up to their madness and calls it genius. Hobart's legacy is a mirror held up to all of them, a reminder that the limits we face are rarely physical. They are imagined. The difference between failure and transformation lies in the persistence to keep building, even when no one believes. He taught us that courage is not only running into battle, but standing alone against ridicule with an idea you refuse to let die. Today, as machines become smarter and wars more abstract, his story remains painfully relevant because it speaks to something timeless: the human need to innovate not for power, but for survival, for others, for hope. When we strip away the noise of history, what remains is one simple truth that Hobart lived and proved: that greatness often begins with a single question whispered in the dark. What if? And maybe that's the lesson buried beneath every machine he built and every field he once walked. That progress in its purest form is just faith given shape. Faith that a single mind, armed with nothing but conviction and courage, can change the direction of the world. Percy Hobart didn't just help win a war, he reminded us that even in humanity's darkest chapters, there is always light in creation, and that sometimes the future begins with one crazy farmer who refuses to stop imagining a better way. Decades after D-Day, when the last of the funnies had rusted in forgotten fields and the roar of their engines was just a ghostly memory, the spirit of Percy Hobart still lingered wherever people dared to challenge impossibility. His machines, once mocked and then revered, were scrapped, melted, repurposed into peacetime steel. Bridges, tractors, even playgrounds. Yet the idea behind them refused to die. Every engineer who faced an unsolvable problem, every soldier who looked at an obstacle and thought, there must be another way, was, in some small, invisible way, carrying Hobart's fire. The war had ended, but his philosophy, that imagination is the sharpest weapon of all, lived on in the DNA of invention. In the Cold War years, as nations raced for dominance, military engineers revisited his blueprints. They saw in those crude, hand-drawn sketches the foundation of modern armored warfare. Tanks designed not just to fight, but to adapt. Every bridge layer, every mine clearer, every amphibious vehicle that came after carried his signature. Silent but undeniable. And beyond war, his influence reached farther still. Civil engineers studying disaster zones, rescue teams navigating rubble, even farmers modernizing their tools. They were unknowingly echoing the same spirit that once welded hope in a barn. For Hobart's story was never just about a war won, it was about a truth rediscovered. That creation, not destruction, defines humanity's survival. In classrooms and training camps, young cadets began to hear whispers of him, the crazy farmer who refused to surrender to logic. They studied his funnies not as relics, but as parables, how one man armed with defiance and a wrench changed the tide of history. And though few could ever match his courage, they could learn from his refusal to quit. Time, however, is cruel to memory. As the veterans who had witnessed his miracles faded into history, so too did the name Percy Hobart. Museums displayed his machines without his story. Books mentioned him in passing. Yet for those who dig deeper, for those who listen between the lines of history, his presence remains, a quiet heartbeat beneath the noise of progress. Because Hobart's victory was never about recognition, it was about proving that belief itself is a force of nature. He showed that genius can exist in anyone, even in a dismissed soldier, even in a farmer covered in grease, even in someone the world laughs at. That lesson outlived the tanks, the generals, and the wars. It lives in every act of creation born from struggle, in every moment when someone looks at failure and says, "Not yet." Perhaps that's the truest measure of immortality. Not the monuments we leave behind, but the courage we awaken in others. So when we look at the rusted remnants of Hobart's machines and the calm waves of Normandy's shore, we're not just seeing history, we're seeing a promise. A promise that even in our darkest hours, innovation and faith can cut through the impossible. And if one crazy farmer could build hope out of steel and defiance, then maybe every generation still has its own Hobart waiting, quietly, stubbornly, ready to build the next miracle the world doesn't yet believe in. In the quiet hush of the modern world, where satellites circle the Earth and wars are fought with invisible code instead of clashing steel, the story of Percy Hobart feels almost mythical, a relic from a time when courage was measured not in titles but in the willingness to stand alone against doubt. Yet beneath every innovation that reshapes the world, there still beats the same stubborn pulse that once drove a forgotten farmer to build machines no one believed in. The beaches he helped conquer are now calm and golden, the waves gentle where death once ruled. Tourists walk where tanks once crawled, unaware that the sand beneath their feet was once scorched by fire and fear, and made safe by the mind of a man who refused to accept defeat. The sea, eternal and indifferent, washes over the remnants of his funnies, carrying fragments of rusted steel into the deep, pieces of history dissolving into legend. But legend, unlike metal, does not decay. It lingers in the imagination, whispering through time that the power to change the world doesn't belong to the chosen or the privileged. It belongs to those who dare to dream when everyone else has stopped. Hobart's life remains a testament to the invisible heroes, the thinkers, builders, rebels, and visionaries who work in silence, who face rejection not once but 1,000 times, and who keep creating because they can't bear not to. His machines were made of bolts and armor, but his real invention was a philosophy. That persistence is a form of faith. Every invention since, every bridge that connects, every vehicle that saves, every design that defies logic, carries the fingerprint of that faith. It is the same belief that rebuilt Europe, that fueled the leap to the stars, that continues to drive humanity forward against the weight of its own disbelief. Hobart's journey reminds us that history's true engine is not power or politics, but imagination under fire. He proved that the extraordinary is simply the ordinary, given enough heart. And though the world moves faster now, his lesson remains painfully relevant, because the human spirit, like his tanks, still moves best when the ground ahead looks impossible. Every age has its obstacles, its critics, its fortresses of doubt, but also somewhere a crazy farmer with a blueprint no one understands yet. Maybe that's the quiet echo of Hobart's life, the reminder that we are all builders of something greater than ourselves. Whether it's freedom, invention, or hope, what we create endures only because someone once refused to stop believing. And so, as the sun sets over Normandy's shores, the tide touches the graves of the fallen, and the wind hums through the fields of England, where Hobart once sketched his dreams, the story completes its circle. The war he helped win has ended, but the spirit that guided him, the courage to imagine beyond reason, will never fade. Because every time the world faces the impossible, every time someone whispers, there has to be a better way, the ghost of that crazy farmer rises again, quiet, determined, unshakable, ready to build the next miracle that will change history forever. 1944. The world was on fire. Allied generals were desperate, their plans hanging by a thread. The beaches of northern France, soon to be called D-Day, waited like a sleeping monster, bristling with steel, mines, and death. Every inch of sand was trapped. Every approach was wired to kill. Engineers, soldiers, and scientists stared at the impossible maps of Omaha and Sword Beach and saw only one thing: failure. But far from the strategy rooms of London, in the quiet fields of Lincolnshire, a simple farmer was working on something that made no sense to anyone. A strange, rattling machine that looked like it belonged in a junkyard, not on a battlefield. His neighbors called it madness. His army contacts called it a waste of time. But on June 6, 1944, That crazy machine would save thousands of lives and change the course of the war forever. His name was Percy Hobart, a man born not into genius or glory, but into the mud and grit